I wasn't adopted. I was bought. Those 7 words came screaming out of my son, across our dining room table, in front of 40 donors, 3 reporters, and my husband, a sitting United States Senator from Virginia. He was holding a folder. Inside it was a signature that didn't belong to the lawyer who supposedly filed his adoption papers 12 years ago. Picture the family photo on our Christmas cards, the one everyone in Virginia recognizes. Senator Richard Hartwell, his devoted wife, and their miracle son, rescued from a Russian orphanage. That photo sat on magazine covers for a decade. In 1 second, in front of everyone who mattered to my husband's career, my son ripped it apart with his bare hands. I stood there holding a wine glass I forgot I was holding, and the floor disappeared underneath me. Because the look on my husband's face wasn't confusion, it was fear. The kind of fear a man gets when a secret he buried finally claws its way out of the ground. If you were me, watching your child's identity collapse in real time, what would you do? Comfort your son or protect your husband's name? Before you judge me, you need to hear everything. By the end of this story, you'll be asking yourself the same question I still ask myself every night. Am I in the wrong here? Stick around, because this story gets so much worse. If it moves you even a little, please hit subscribe now. Let me back up. 12 years ago, Richard and I flew to a small orphanage outside Yekaterinburg to bring home a 5-year-old boy named Alexei. Richard had just made his name as the young prosecutor who helped bring down a human trafficking ring smuggling children through fake adoption agencies. Operation Winter Harbor, they called it. It made national news. Senators shook his hand at galas. And 2 years after that operation ended, we adopted a little boy from Russia and gave him a new name, Alex Hartwell. The press loved it. The rescuer becomes the rescuer of his own son. Nobody ever asked me why the adoption happened so fast, why there was no waiting list, no home study delay, no red tape. I was 31 years old and desperate for a child. I didn't ask questions. I just held my son on that plane home and thought, this is the happiest day of my life. For 12 years, I believed that story completely. Alex grew up in our house in McLean, Virginia, with a swing set and a golden retriever and a mother who tucked him in every night. He called Richard Dad at his 3rd grade graduation, and the whole gym cried. I built my entire identity around being the wife who helped save a little boy from a broken system. Richard built his entire career on it. Every campaign ad had Alex's face in it. Every stump speech mentioned, the day I found my son. I never once imagined that sentence had a second meaning. So when Alex screamed those words at the fundraiser, I didn't understand at first. I thought maybe he was having a breakdown. Maybe therapy had stirred something up. Maybe a classmate had said something cruel about him being adopted. That's what I told the donors as security quietly walked Alex out of the room, my hand pressed against his back, feeling him shaking under my palm. He's overwhelmed, I said, smiling the smile I've perfected over 16 years of political dinners. Senior year stress. Nobody questioned it. Nobody ever questions the senator's wife when she smiles like that. But in the car, Alex wouldn't look at me. He just held that folder against his chest, like it was the only thing keeping him upright. When we got home, he threw it on the kitchen island and said, "Read it, then tell me I'm wrong." Inside was a photocopy of our original adoption paperwork, the one Richard kept locked in his home office safe, a place I was never supposed to touch. Next to it was a second document Alex had found buried in an old email account Richard forgot still existed, an account from 12 years ago. The signature on our official adoption certificate belonged to a lawyer named Dmitry Volkov. The email thread was between Richard and a man named Yuri Sokolov, discussing a transfer fee of $85,000 for what Sokolov called the Yekaterinburg placement. There was no orphanage listed. There was no adoption agency letterhead. Just a wire transfer confirmation and a line from Richard that made my stomach turn inside out. It said, "Make sure Volkov's signature matches what we filed with the State Department. We cannot have any inconsistency." I read it 4 times before I let myself understand what I was looking at. My husband hadn't rescued a little boy from an orphanage. He had bought him. From the exact same network of traffickers he had built his entire prosecutorial career on dismantling. "Mom," Alex's voice cracked when he said it, and I realized it was the first time in years he'd called me that without irony, without teenage distance, just pure terror. Am I even Russian? Is Alexei even my real name? Do I have a family somewhere still looking for me? I didn't have an answer. I still don't. Not fully. But I wasn't going to let my son sit in that kitchen alone with those questions while his father was upstairs on a call with campaign donors, laughing at something, completely unaware his entire life had just cracked open 2 floors below him. I confronted Richard that night, after the house went quiet. I laid the papers on our bed like evidence at a trial, because in a way, that's exactly what they were. I asked him one question. Did you buy our son? He didn't deny it. That's the part that still haunts me. A man who has spent 20 years crafting perfect answers for every reporter in Virginia looked at me and said nothing for almost a full minute. Then he said, "It's more complicated than that." As if there's a version of buying a child from traffickers that qualifies as complicated instead of monstrous. He told me the truth in pieces, the way guilty men always do, giving you just enough to seem honest, while hiding the parts that would actually destroy him. Operation Winter Harbor had taken down most of Sokolov's network, but not all of it. Sokolov himself walked away with immunity, in exchange for turning on his own partners. And in the chaos of that operation, Richard had seen Alex, a scared 5-year-old boy who'd already been through 2 illegal placements, and instead of routing him through the actual, legal international adoption system, which could have taken years and, more importantly, could have exposed exactly how deep the trafficking ring reached into Richard's own investigation, Richard paid Sokolov directly to make the boy disappear from the case file and reappear as an orphanage adoption instead. I saved him, Richard kept saying, like a man rehearsing a defense. I got him out. Does the paperwork really matter if I gave him a good life? That was the moment I understood something horrifying. My husband didn't see a crime. He saw a shortcut. And worse, I realized Sokolov never actually disappeared from our lives. For 12 years, a man named Yuri had a direct line to blackmail a sitting United States senator. And I had unknowingly hosted him at 2 campaign dinners, where Richard introduced him as an old contact from overseas security consulting. Then came the twist that made my knees buckle. I asked Richard who else knew, who helped forge Volkov's signature, who structured the payments so they'd never surface in a background check during his Senate run. He said one name, and it wasn't a stranger. It was Marion Cole, Richard's chief of staff for the last 9 years. The woman who came to my baby shower for Alex. The woman who sat next to me at his 8th grade graduation. The woman I trusted enough to hand my house key to when we traveled. Marion hadn't just helped bury the original documents. Marion was the one who had personally wired the funds through a shell consulting firm, and Marion had been quietly taking a management fee out of Richard's campaign accounts for over a decade to keep her silent about it. My husband wasn't just paying a trafficker. He'd been paying his own employee to guard the secret, and she had been bleeding him dry for it the entire time, knowing exactly what would happen to his career if she ever stopped smiling and started talking. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in Alex's doorway and watched him finally fall asleep around 4 in the morning, exhausted from crying, and I thought about every single fundraiser where Richard told our adoption story on stage, voice cracking with practiced emotion, donors reaching for their checkbooks. I thought about the foundation Richard started, the one that supports international adoption reform, funded partly by speaking fees earned from telling Alex's story. My son's trauma had been converted into an applause line for over a decade, and I had stood next to my husband on that stage every single time, clapping along. The next morning, Richard tried a new approach. Fear. He sat me down and explained very calmly what would happen if this got out before the general election. Federal charges, trafficking conspiracy, falsifying adoption documents to a foreign government, wire fraud. And worse, he said, quietly. Almost gently, like he was doing me a favor by explaining it, Alex's legal status in this country would come into question too. If people start pulling threads on how he actually entered the U.S., Richard said, immigration could reopen his entire file. He could lose his citizenship status pending review. Is that what you want for him? Do you want to protect him? Or do you want to destroy him to make a point? He was using my son as a hostage to protect himself and dressing it up as love. I want to be honest with you, because you deserve to know exactly how close I came to going along with it. For 3 days, I said nothing. I let Richard tell Alex that the misunderstanding was being handled privately, that a family lawyer was reviewing everything, that it was best if Alex didn't speak to anyone about it, not friends, not teachers, not his therapist. I watched my husband isolate our son the exact same way abusers isolate the people they're afraid will talk. And I let it happen because some small, cowardly part of me was still afraid of losing the life I'd built, the house, the name, the version of myself that got invited to the governor's mansion for Christmas. Then Marion made a mistake. She came to our house on the fourth night, furious, demanding a bigger payout now that Alex knew the truth, insisting Richard's management fee needed to double or she'd go to a reporter herself. I stood outside the study door and listened to a woman I had trusted for 9 years threaten to destroy my son's stability for money, while my husband negotiated with her like he was settling a campaign budget dispute instead of protecting his child. That's when I stopped being afraid and started taking notes. Literally. I bought a burner phone the next morning and started documenting everything, every conversation, every date, every figure Marion mentioned. I drove to a print shop 40 minutes away and made copies of the folder Alex had found, storing them somewhere Richard would never think to look. My late mother's storage unit in Fredericksburg, a place he'd never once asked about because he'd never once cared about my side of the family. I sat Alex down and told him the truth, all of it. No filtering, no protecting his father anymore. He deserved that much. And I asked him one question: what do you want to do? Not what Richard wanted, not what the campaign wanted, what he wanted. He looked at me, 17 years old, more composed than I had been in 3 days, and said, I want the truth to matter more than his career. And in that moment, I realized my son had more integrity at 17 than his father had built in 20 years of public service. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I need to know I wasn't the only one who felt this. If you found out the man you built your entire adult life around had done something unforgivable, and the only way to protect your child was to burn everything down, would you have the courage to strike the match? Because I wasn't sure I did. Not yet. But I was about to find out. 2 days later, I did something I never imagined myself doing. I called Yuri Sokolov's old contact information, the one Richard thought he'd deleted, and I told him I was Richard Hartwell's wife. There was a long silence on the line, and then he laughed, a low, unbothered laugh, like he'd been waiting 12 years for this exact phone call. Your husband still owes me for the last quiet year, he said, and my blood went cold. Not the last 12 years, the last quiet year, which meant Richard hadn't paid him once, back in Yekaterinburg, and walked away. He'd been paying him continuously, every single year Alex had been in our home, disguised inside campaign expense reports as international policy consulting. My husband hadn't committed one crime a decade ago. He had been actively committing it every year since, and every donor check that funded those payments came from people who trusted him to be exactly the man on those campaign posters. I didn't tell Sokolov anything useful. I hung up before he could ask questions, my hands shaking so badly I dropped the burner phone on the kitchen floor. But now I had something Richard didn't know I had: a recorded call, a voice confirming ongoing payments, and a motive that went far beyond one desperate decision 12 years ago. This wasn't a man who made one terrible choice to save a child. This was a man who had built an entire second financial life around hiding what he'd done, and he had let his own son grow up as collateral in that arrangement without ever once telling him the truth. That same week, Alex asked me something that broke whatever was left of my heart. He asked if his real mother, his biological mother back in Russia, was even told he was being adopted, or if she'd been paid to, or lied to, or if she was even still alive somewhere, wondering what happened to her son. I didn't have an answer. I still don't. But I promised him I would find out, and that promise became the only thing that mattered to me more than protecting the life I used to have. I met with a family law attorney under a fake consultation name, paid in cash, at an office 2 counties away from anyone who knew us. I laid everything out: forged signatures, wire transfers, ongoing payments disguised as consulting fees, a chief of staff actively extorting a sitting senator, a trafficker still operating under a different name, according to public records I'd found using nothing but the burner phone and 3 sleepless nights. The attorney went quiet for a long time after I finished, then said something I will never forget. You understand that once this moves forward, there is no version where your husband survives this politically. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Alex's face at the fundraiser. I thought about every applause line built on his trauma. I thought about Marion threatening to double her silence money in my own living room, while my husband negotiated instead of calling the police on the woman blackmailing him. And I thought about every single time I had smiled next to Richard on stage, unknowingly performing gratitude for a rescue that was never a rescue at all. I'm completely prepared, I told the attorney. And for the first time in 12 years, I meant every word I said with my full chest, without performing it for anyone watching. I didn't leak the story to a reporter or scream it on social media. I did something Richard never saw coming, because he spent 20 years underestimating the woman beside him. I waited for his biggest moment, the state party's endorsement dinner, 600 donors, every local news camera in Virginia, and I walked on stage before he did. I didn't need notes. I had lived every sentence of it for 3 weeks. I told them about Operation Winter Harbor, and then I told them what it actually covered up. I played 12 seconds of Sokolov's recorded voice through the podium speakers. I held up the wire transfer confirmations, the forged signature, the consulting fees that were really blackmail payments to his own chief of staff. I watched 600 faces shift from confusion to horror in real time, and I watched my husband's face turn the color of the tablecloth. Federal investigators were already waiting outside, because 2 days earlier, I had walked into an FBI field office and handed them everything myself. Not a scandal for the cameras, but a case built the way my son deserved, solid enough that nobody could spin it away by morning. Richard didn't get to resign gracefully. He was escorted out of his own dinner. Marion was arrested within the week, her years of quiet extortion caught on the same paper trail she thought she controlled. Sokolov, the man who sold my son like a line item, is now the subject of a federal trafficking investigation reaching back further than either of us imagined. Alex and I moved out that same week. We didn't take the house, the name, or a single dollar tied to that campaign. We took each other, and we started searching, properly and legally, for any information about his birth mother, because he deserves an answer I still owe him. People ask if I destroyed my family to protect a headline. Here's my answer. I didn't destroy my family. I protected the only member of it who never had a choice in any of this. So I'll ask what I asked myself that night. Am I in the wrong for choosing my son's truth over my husband's career? Or was I only wrong for staying silent this long? Tell me honestly in the comments. And if this story reached you, subscribe, because truth always finds its way out.